Quon luthier here, and today I want to talk to you about wood. And in terms of making an ukulele or another musical instrument, or even perhaps a piece of furniture, it's good to understand the nature of wood and the best parts of wood, how to select lumber or timber for your project. So we're going to start with looking at this piece right here, which is represents a cross-section of a log that would be milled, let's say, for lumber. And if we look at it, we see that the very center here of this, which has some rod in it, and this piece, which is called the pith. This is the very center. This is the part where when the little seedling was growing, the first growth happened. Outside of that, we have some larger rings around here, which are more irregular shaped, and those rings we call the juvenile rings, or the juvenile portion of the wood, juvenile wood. Then when we get out to this area here, we have what we call the heartwood, and then out towards this we have the sapwood, which is the lighter wood, and then of course the bark is on the outside. So what happens as the tree grows is that the sapwood, which is actually the only living part of the wood, if it dies as more sapwood is created, and then that sapwood becomes heartwood. And so the very center of this area here, the pith, is very unstable. And then the juvenile wood is sort of like a juvenile human being. It's rather unstable also. So it's tend to do warping and that kind of thing. And the heartwood is the area where the best wood is. And then we get to the sapwood. The sapwood, interestingly enough, has no resistance to, or less resistance rather, to bugs and decay, whereas the heartwood has more resistance, and it's a stronger wood. It's actually supporting the main portion of the tree when it's growing. When we look at these little checks that have happened with this piece of wood drying, we should notice that those checks often happen where the rays of the wood are. As these rings are actually running up and down the tree, the rays, which are more evident in a piece of oak. So if we look at this piece of oak, you can see these rays that go out sideways like this. Now those rays are meant to stabilize the tree as it's growing, and they grow from the center towards the outside of the tree, and they'll grow through the sapwood. So those rays, when you have a piece of wood, like a piece of oak flooring or something, will show up as little light specks on the surface of the wood. So when you see those little specks on the surface of a piece of oak flooring or something, you know that it's being created by those rays. So all trees have rays. It's just that some trees' rays are more visible than others. So if we look at a piece of alder, and then here's a piece of alder here, we can see that this has very tight grain. The rings are very close together, meaning it's just the way it grows. And you can see here the sapwood on the outside, that pale portion, and then we have the heartwood here coming down towards the pith area, which is not evident in this. But anytime you have these checks, as in this piece, they're following the rays that are in the wood. So when you're splitting your firewood or whatever, you know, that's the place to hit it with your axe. Now when milling wood, it's there are different kinds of sawing up the wood. So some wood is sawn what they call just plain sawn, and plain sawn means that the sawmill just comes across and cuts boards all in a line across the whole log like this. And so when we have this piece, we'll notice that the grain will be curved across the top of the board in a fashion like that, and that's called cathedral grain. So if we look at this little piece of walnut here, and if you can see the grain in this end grain here, you can see how it goes that way. So this is more towards probably the outside of the heartwood, and it creates a grain on the surface that has a lot of interesting marks in it like this. It's called, and that would be more of a cathedral type. Whereas if we get a quarter sawn piece of wood. And quarter sawn means that this log would be cut into quarters like this, and then each one of those quarters is cut from this side being on the flat down, and the sawyer would just cut pieces across like this. And that creates a grain where the rings are going to be more perpendicular to the piece. So if we look at this little piece of pine here, we can see that it does have that kind of grain in it, where you can see the pattern, the end grain is running that way. The issue with that is that then when we look at the flat, we don't have this cathedral pattern. We have pretty much just a straight grain pattern here. This is a more stable piece of wood. When a piece of wood warps, it has a tendency for these rings here to want to straighten out. And so if we cut a piece of board across like this piece would want to warp up like that, so that these rings would form a straight line. Whereas when they're already straight, such as in this piece of pine like this, that's not an issue. So this is obviously, there's a third kind of sawing, which is called rift sawing. And rift sawing means that we cut it into quarters, and then we cut pie-shaped pieces out of that. So every piece basically becomes like that one piece of quarter sawn. Now, if you're looking for lumber to build something, and you're looking for just plain sawn wood, you can get these pieces that come across this way, right from the center, will have that quarter sawn quality to them, because that piece comes right out of that area. But there'll be other pieces too. If you're buying lumber for a project, avoid buying anything that has the pith or juvenile rings in it. You want to get the wood that has the heartwood. So that tells you a bit about how those things are made. You know how, I mean, in terms of wood. So when we look at a piece of wood like this, we can see that this is, you can see the rings in this. This is getting towards the center. These are juvenile rings here, and then the heartwood is going to be more out to this side here on this piece of walnut. And so this is obviously unstable, and you can see what it's doing. It's actually, you can see that, I don't know if the camera will show it, but there's a warp where these ends are coming up, so the grain is trying to straighten. So this is not a stable piece of wood here. And you know, if you were going to use anything, you'd want to use this portion here that shows more the quarter sawn, but then as we get towards the center, it gets kind of unstable in this area. So when we're looking at wood for building instruments, we're looking at normally like this piece of rosewood here. This is, you can see the grain is, the pieces, the rings are fairly close together, the lines, and if we look at the edge, we can see that this is actually a quarter sawn piece of wood. If it was rift sawn, there would be just straight across like this. This could be a rift sawn piece right here. But so if we have wood where the grain is coming at across at an angle, such as in this piece of mahogany here, like this, the way to use that wood and make it more stable is to book match the pieces. And that's what I do with my necks, is that I take the piece and I rip it in half lengthwise, and then I flip it over. And actually in this case I put in a rosewood spine to really make it stable. But this way the forces of the wood are balanced from side to side, which makes it very stable. The other thing you want to watch out for if you're making an instrument is going to be the issue of drying. So if we're looking at wood that is, let me see if I can get this camera here to work a little better for me. So if we're looking at a dry wood, there's air dry wood and there's kiln dried wood. So a lot of kiln dried wood is kiln dried too fast and with too high of a heat. And what that does is it dries the outside portion of the board very fast, and the inside is still a little bit damp or wet. What that does is it shrinks the outside while the inside has moisture and is still slightly swollen. That wood is very unstable, and you see a lot of this wood in big box stores, construction grade lumber, that you end up with 2x4s that look like dog's legs. They're just really curved because the internal forces of the wood are imbalanced and it causes it to warp. The other thing that kiln drying does is it case hardens the wood, and what this means is that when you heat the wood above 400 degrees, it changes the chemical or the cellular composition of the fibers in the wood, and it makes them harder and it makes them stiffer. Of course, this is something that a luthier or a person who's making instruments does not want, because we're often bending wood to make sides of a guitar, for example, that has that beautiful shape. Those are all done with heat, when you heat up the wood with a little moisture in it or without moisture, depending on the species of wood. But it's better to have air-dried wood, which has been dried over a long period of time. When you're dealing with woods like walnut and certain other woods like rosewood that have natural pigments in the fibers of the wood, kiln drying also bleeds those colors throughout the wood and can make the wood look kind of dull, and it doesn't show the color as rich. As we're air dried slowly, the colors in the wood stay in the areas that they are. They're not steamed into other portions of the wood. So we often prefer to use air-dried wood. I prefer air-dried wood, and I prefer quarter sawn or rift sawn wood. And another reason for choosing quarter sawn or rift sawn wood is that when we look at wood, the wood, we all know that wood, in terms of its shrinking, expansion, and contraction, doesn't happen much at all along the length of the board. The length of the board stays relatively stable in terms of its dimension. In terms of its thickness, though, however, the thickness of the wood will change along the line of the ring. So if we look at this little piece of pine again that's here, and you can see the rings in this piece of pine, this piece of wood will actually shrink more this way than it will this way. So that's why when we build a top or a back of a musical instrument, we're always looking for either the quarter sawn or rift sawn wood, because it's going to be more stable in terms of the width, in terms of expansion and contraction. So it's good to understand all these qualities, and also to know that the wood was once alive and it had to move and to adjust to winds and temperature changes and seasons and all those things, and that it affects each piece of wood differently. Each tree is very different, even along the same species. So you can't really make a generalization. You have to look at each individual piece of wood. So when I get my wood, the first thing that I do is, often my wood comes from sources that are different from the climate that I live in. Maybe it comes from California or somewhere else. This is koa, and this koa came from Hawaii, and where the climate is quite a bit different than it is here in Oregon. So when I get it, I put it in stickers like this, which are these little boards that go between the wood, and I put it in these things, and I have these bungee cords to keep it, and that holds it flat. And I also have it so that there's space in between, and I'll let this sit in my shop for 6 months to a year, even though it's sold to me dry. I want it to acclimatize to the climate that I live in and in my shop. So when I build out of it, it stays relatively stable. So all of this wood, and you can see here's some sapwood on this koa here that's right in this one area. The sapwood on this koa being dry is probably pretty stable, but all of this wood is heartwood, or with a little bit of sapwood there. There's no pith in any of it, and you can see this is just a gorgeous piece, and you can see that it has lots of flame in it, in the wood. This is not sanded or anything. This is just right out of being sawn and then being planed. So there's nothing has been sanded here. So I will probably make my next ukulele out of this wood here, this koa, which is lovely wood and it has great tonal qualities. I hope this video has been helpful for you, and this kind of wood here, this piece of alder and the oak and those things, I think that where they're going to go is in there in my little wood stove, because they're not really good for anything else. If you've enjoyed this and it's been useful to you, then give it a like, and I'll see you next time. Subscribe to my channel. Bye for now.